all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. 2 sentences. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Arguably, that's the second Constitution, the second founding that we've lived under since its ratification in 1868 and its drafting in 1866. There are 4 other sections of the 14th Amendment. The third section got a great deal of publicity last winter in the Colorado case, where that state's Supreme Court attempted to use Section 3 for the first time to disqualify a former president from running for office again because they deemed he had committed insurrection. The current Supreme Court said, no, you cannot use Section 3 for that purpose. The Supreme Court is on a run right now of terrible decisions, and that's one of them. Section 3 may never be used now, ever, in American history, at least whatever ever means. But the reason it was there, it was written to prevent former Confederates from ever running for high office, and particularly the presidency, ever again. Namely, Jefferson Davis, who will soon be pardoned just after they passed it. He'll be released from prison, never pardoned. Released from prison and never prosecuted. That's a big difference. In 1867. But back to Section 1. It was written by this man, John Bingham, not as widely known among Americans as he should be. I think he should be on a stamp, although his good looks aren't the reason. John Bingham wrote Section 1 of the 14th Amendment out of the vigorous, brutal debates that Congress had, with 11 states still out of the Union, mind you, in the winter of 1866. For over 2 months, they fiercely debated this thing that was now called the 14th Amendment. What would it be? What were their responsibilities? What did they need to do now to define what emancipation would mean? What did they need to do to define what these former states would be? Are they states again? How do they become states again? How do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And they kept looking in the Constitution for that section that said if you have a civil war, and 11 states secede from the Union, here's what you do. It's not there. It's why the debate was so ferocious. And among the many, oh God, if you ever want to just blow some good time, read the Congressional Globe online. It's all digitized for those debates of the winter of 1866. They're incredible. Read those debates. John Bingham of Ohio, an evangelical Christian, radical Republican, abolitionist, maybe not the most radical of abolitionists. After all, he got elected to Congress. from South Central Ohio. But John Bingham, who had actually been the head of the tribunal that prosecuted the case against John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy, hell of a lawyer, constitutional thinker, would get up in Congress and say, among many other things, this legislation will be felt by generations of men after we have all paid the debt of nature. He wanted, he said, to arm Congress, not the president, arm Congress with the power to enforce the Bill of Rights as it stands in the Constitution in the states. Note every word of that quote. He wants Congress to have this power to enforce the Bill of Rights in the states, the federal government. The 14th Amendment was intended to at least blunt, if not turn around, the tradition of states' rights. Reconstruction, Bingham believed, and he had certainly enough allies here, had to be federal Reconstruction. Somebody had lost this war, big time. Somebody had seceded from the Union and got crushed. And somebody had to run the process to put them back together again. Enforce the Bill of Rights in the states. That's going to be the hardest thing of all. But Section 1, you cannot say it often enough, is the essence of the Second Constitution. You live under if you can keep it, you live under the Constitution created in Washington in 1866, 67, and 68, not as much under the Philadelphia Constitution of 1789. These three amendments, the first Civil Rights Act, which we'll define in a moment, the Reconstruction Acts, and their scope and scale as they were put in place, redefined the U.S. Constitution. There's a good reason that so many scholars now, led by Eric Foner, call this a second founding. The Union had been destroyed. Now, whether you take Lincoln's view or whoever's view that the states couldn't formally leave the Union, or yes, they did leave the Union, they committed state suicide, so on and so forth, the war had happened. And it killed 700,000 plus people. The 14th Amendment is rooted first in that blood. It also has much deeper roots, much deeper roots. It's rooted in those petitions that those black soldiers wrote at the time of the American Revolution that we wrote about in the Yale and Slavery book all over Connecticut here, demanding their freedom and rights based on their service in the Continental Army. It's rooted in every abolitionist word ever spoken and written and published. It's rooted in ancient conceptions of equality, which are somewhere there in the epistles of Paul, depending on how you read him. Equality is a very, very, very difficult thing, though, isn't it? Equal protection of the laws. I'm told by my lawyer friends, and I've been told this for years, that about 2/3 of all litigation in American courtrooms, one way or another, is 14th Amendment litigation. What is equal protection? The Citizens United case by the Supreme Court, which lets billionaires spend all the money they want on elections and by-elections, is a 14th Amendment case. It was their right. They get Elon Musk has equal protection now. Did you vote for that? I don't want to know how you voted. Equality is such a tricky, amazing, amazing concept. James Baldwin left this little line. It's a beautiful line. It's typical of James Baldwin warning us. He said, it is easy to, he wrote this in 1956, just as the civil rights movement was beginning. It is easy to proclaim all souls equal in the sight of God. But it is hard to make men equal on earth in the sight of other men. We're equal before nature. We're equal before God. Natural rights. But you and I are equal right now before each other about this and this and this and that and this and this and this and that and access to this and access to that and the right to that fellowship and this. That's where the hard part is. Because we're people. Whoops. Sorry. But that's why people have laws. All right, back up with me. Why is Bingham and his friends so concerned about getting this idea at least launched into the Constitution? Do they know where it's all going? Of course not. Did Lincoln know what that word equality meant? In the Gettysburg Address, don't forget, Lincoln mouthed the word equality in the Gettysburg Address. And lest we forget, so did Thomas Jefferson. A long time before that, in the Declaration of Independence. The word is always there for Americans. Go with me to Charleston, South Carolina, just briefly. It's the spring of 1865, winter spring. Charleston was evacuated by Confederate troops and lots of Confederate people in February. Charleston had been bombarded. I've told you this before. Charleston had been bombarded for 8 months, and I showed you, I think, a picture or two of the ruins of Charleston. The first regiment to march up Meeting Street, the main street of Charleston, was the 21st U.S. Colored Infantry. They accepted the surrender of the city. A lot of white troops came in as well. There's going to be a huge ceremony out on Fort Sumter on the actual anniversary of the firing on Fort Sumter 4 years earlier. They will re-raise the American flag. All kinds of dignitaries were there, including William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, who the press said wept uncontrollably. Henry Ward Beecher was the orator of the day, and Beecher never gave short speeches. And when the wind blew his notes away, apparently the crowd was kind of glad. But back in town, out at the old Planters Race Course, horse track, known as the Washington Race Course, in what is today Hampton Park, named for Wade Hampton, the white supremacist redeemer governor of South Carolina. Black folk and a few allies had gathered now for weeks to bury some dead. Turns out in the infield of the Planters, and by the way, this was the greatest horse track in the South. This is where the greatest horse races occurred. The Planters, Low Country Planters Race Course was everything to them. And that Washington Race Course had a famous building, a grandstand. But in the last months of the war, they converted the whole thing into a prison for Union soldiers. And the count we have is that about 257 Union soldiers had died in the open-air prison. And they had all been taken out and buried behind the grandstand in a mass grave, unmarked, unnamed. Now, when the Confederates abandoned the city, a whole bunch of black carpenters and skilled craftsmen and others got together. Most of the population left in Charleston was the black population, the former enslaved population, some of whom are already sending their children over to these things called freedmen's schools. But they got their act together and they started to reinter these graves and put up stones and proper mounds. And they tried to count them. And they built a white fence. There's this drawing, which was in Harper's in 1867. They built a white fence all the way around it. It's right behind where the grandstand once was. And then they built a little archway to go into the cemetery compound. And over the archway, they painted the inscription, Martyrs of the Race Course. And on May 1st, 1865, they held a parade on the racetrack, led by about 3,000 black women and children behind them and with them, carrying armloads of all kinds of flowers, followed by black men, followed by Union troops, black and white. They paraded around the race course, humming and singing John Brown's Body. They gathered over here as many as could fit in the cemetery. They listened to a children's choir sing America the Beautiful, the Star-Spangled Banner, and 2 or 3 Negro spirituals. They heard from 3 preachers from the Charleston area. And then they went back into the infield of the old racetrack and did what most of us do on Memorial Day. Children ran races. They had a special platform where all kinds of people gave speeches. And they had picnics. That's the first Memorial Day. I had the amazing good luck to find this in a file at the Lamont Library at Harvard in about somewhere in the late 90s when I was working on the book Race and Reunion. I'd been sitting in that archive for weeks on end, and one day the archivist said, "You the one doing this memory stuff?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, we got this bunch of boxes back here, the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. They're not accessed fully, formally yet, but you'd be welcome to look at them." I said, "Oh, sure." Turns out, long story short, I started diving in. I don't know if it was the first box or the second box or the second or third box. And there was a file labeled First Decoration Day. I thought, that's cool. I'm going to have to write about Memorial Day in this book. Formal origins were 1868 by the Grand Army of the Republic, the Veterans Organization. But I opened this up, and quite unbelievably, never say never in an archive, folks. They often don't even know what they have. On a piece of cardboard was that story I just told you. At the bottom of it, it said Berwick, New York Tribune, with a date in May, 1865. I didn't know it at the time, but Berwick was the pen name for James Redpath, a white abolitionist from the North who was in Charleston creating freedmen's schools and helped, at least, to organize this parade. I thought at first, this is just too good to be true. This is not true. I had my archive prayers going, please God, make this true. And I went over, crossed the quad to the microfilm room, and I started getting out the New York Tribune. The date that had been used by whatever old veteran wrote this down, it was a verbatim article in the New York Tribune. He'd put the wrong date on it. And when I looked up that date, there was nothing there. And I thought, damn, you know. But I just kept cranking. Sure enough, he just had the wrong date by 6 days or something. And there it was. I immediately called an archive in Charleston, the Avery Research Center, which is a black research center, small but very important. And I already knew an archivist there because I had worked there. And I said, hey, you ever heard of this story? He said, no, it didn't happen. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, was there any other Charleston newspaper, any newspapers publishing by May of '65? Had the Charleston Courier, or there were two major Charleston newspapers. He said, yeah, I think so. We have them all on microfilm. I said, would you look? Just start looking on May 2nd, please. He called me back within about an hour or two. He said, yeah, here it is. A much longer article. He said, yeah, a children's choir sings in the gravesite. I said, what? Woo! Said, yeah, 3 preachers. Woo! Woo! And it goes on and on and on. I got 2 sources. I can go with it. And I started digging around and digging around and digging around. Harper's had a drawing of it in 1867. This was a totally lost story. It got crushed by the lost cause. This incredible drawing of the gravesite. And then, photograph of the gravesite. This came out later. Long story short, I already said that, didn't I? I think I first published something about this in Columbia, South Carolina newspaper, then a Charleston newspaper picked it up, and somebody else picked it up, and somebody else picked it up. And finally, on Memorial Day 2011, the New York Times ran a column I wrote called Forgetting Why We Remember. And we finally got this story widely known. And shortly after that, the mayor of Charleston, Joe Riley, and I, with about 3 black preachers, dedicated a new marker up in Hampton Park to the first Decoration Day. There are other cities and towns and graveyards that claim to be the first site of Memorial Day. And does it matter where it was done first? Not necessarily. But they all claim 1866. They're a year late. Memorial Day was created by African American freed people, declaring their own Independence Day, their own liberty, by properly burying the soldiers who died for their freedom. Now, Bingham didn't know about this story, but pretty soon Memorial Day was everywhere, officially created by the Grand Army of the Republic in 1868. You could not grow up in a town or city in the United States, north or south, and not have seen, experienced, heard about, participated in some kind of Memorial Day gathering. This is a paint, I wish I had the color version of this because it's beautiful. Typical of a Northern Memorial Day by the 1870s or into the early 80s. This painting depicts little girls dressed in white, of course. Sometimes long lines of them decorating the graves. The term comes from decorating graves. My parents always called Memorial Day Decoration Day. I finally understood it. It means flowers, and flowers are available in May in abundance. Oh dear. Whoops, sorry. I forget who found this photograph. It's just been more and more and more and more stuff has been found, and thank God it has. Now, so the radical Republicans, when they tried to wrest control of Reconstruction away from Where is he? Andrew Johnson. I thought I had a bigger Johnson, but there he is up in the corner. Andrew Johnson on your upper left. Thaddeus Stevens next to him, looking like what he was. Lyman Trumbull on your lower left, very important congressman from Illinois, mostly an ally of Lincoln's, not always, sometimes quite moderate and conservative, but he's going to be the author of the Civil Rights Act. It's going to show that even moderate Republicans had come to see that they had a gigantic responsibility to redefine the country in the wake of emancipation as best they could. And Charles Sumner, the radical, always was a radical, Republican from, Massachusetts. Now, what is Reconstruction? Let me run that by you just a bit. I want to say a little bit more about that 14th Amendment, how it came about, but then we want to compare the struggle here between Johnson and the radicals, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, Trumbull, Bingham, and many others. Reconstruction was an era of sort of tragic aspirations. Tragic because it comes out of a massive war. Musical accompaniment, welcome, but let me choose the music. Okay. Reconstruction was one long, agonizing referendum on the meaning of the war. You know, we can always think about Reconstruction as, it's a bunch of laws, it's a bunch of enactments, it's a whole bunch of, hold on one second, I got to show you a book. Yeah. There it is. Students and everybody else. There's a little reader you're reading this week and next, edited by Steve Prince, former PhD student of mine. He did a perfect job here of putting together the right documents and a nice tight introduction to radical Reconstruction, which he draws mostly from my lecture, but that's okay. No, it's great. He knows what he's talking about. But it's more than just a bunch of laws and enactments. It's this amazing attempt to respond to the meaning and the results of that war. Sometimes was failure. What were the verdicts of Appomattox? Who and what actually won? That's what they're trying to do. The great challenge of Reconstruction was to determine how a national blood feud with 700,000 dead, the most ever in any war to that time. How do you take this national blood feud and begin to somehow reconcile it and create a new nation? How do you bring that thing back together? Do you bring that thing back together? And if you do, what are you going to do with those ex-Confederates? You're going to wish them away as Lincoln did? Just go into exile, fine, please. Y'all want to go to Brazil? Bye. A lot did go to Brazil. This task was harrowing because the survivors on both sides have to still inhabit the same land, just like we do after this election. We have to live here. You don't need me to tell you that. And they're going to have to eventually inhabit the same government. That's harder. How do you make the eventual logic of sectional reconciliation compatible with the logic of that revolution of 1863, which is emancipation? You've just defeated the planter class. You've just defeated the Slavocracy. You've defeated slavery. You think, you hope. And you put those people back together with the people who defeated them and killed thousands and thousands of their brothers and husbands. How do you square black freedom and the stirrings of this thing called equality with a cause that had lost everything except its unbroken faith in white supremacy. How do you compromise with white supremacy if you're John Bingham? Lincoln called the war in the Gettysburg Address a testing. That famous word, a testing, whether a republic so founded and so conceived could long endure. Reconstruction was an even greater testing. How do you create a new one that can endure? And how do you do it through these concepts of healing and justice? Reconstruction and the memory of the Civil War is always a collision between these two enormous ideas. They're not just concepts. They're not just abstractions. How do you heal a place that's had this largest civil war ever fought and do it with justice? Justice to whom? Justice to all the 4 million freed people. One hopes, they hope. But what justice might be to the freed people is not the same thing as white folks in Georgia who experienced Sherman's March to the Sea, lost all of their land and 3 of their brothers. Justice to them ain't going to be the same thing. And they are very soon going to be organizing something called the Ku Klux Klan and a bunch of other organizations that kept modeling them to fight back. Healing and justice, it's always the struggle. Somebody won, though, and somebody lost. Now, all right. Andrew Johnson comes to the scene, so to speak. Does he ever? As the saying went in Tennessee, old Andy never went back on his raisin, which means he was always where he was from. That's a translation of that line I had up there. He was the Jacksonian Democrat in his early life. You may be wondering, what the hell was he doing on Lincoln's ticket in 1864, since he's a peculiar dude. He had always been a staunch states' rightist and pro-slavery and racist to the bone, but he hated secession. He did not believe secession possible. Yeah, okay, contradictions if you like, but contradictions make the world go round. In 1861, he was the only Southern senator from a seceded state who did not leave his seat. Now, that took some, kahunas. In 1862, Lincoln appointed him the war governor of Tennessee because he represented unionism. Once the Union Army occupied enough of Tennessee that Lincoln could say, well, we'll start reconstructing something of a government and call Andrew Johnson its governor. That was a sort of a fictional government at first, but nevertheless, they had to start somewhere. He'd always been an outsider in politics, a kind of a maverick. Now, Lincoln puts him on the ticket in 64, and by the way, Lincoln is honored and honored and honored as the greatest this and the greatest that, and for good reason. But we never talk too much about, why did you put Andrew Johnson on that ticket, man? Well, the reason was he was a unionist. He dropped Hannibal Hamlin, his running, who remembers Hannibal Hamlin? Lincoln's running mate in 1860 from New Hampshire. He didn't need New Hampshire anymore. He needed a border state, Confederate state, unionist. But boy, he got more than he perhaps had bargained for. Yes, he was a bit drunk at his inauguration as vice president, but that's largely because he wasn't a perpetual drunk. You can read that someplace. That's not true. But he had a horrific toothache and he had been swilling down some bourbon. And he stood there apparently a little unsteady. Johnson's plan of Reconstruction was to take Lincoln's 10% plan and make it even more lenient. Even more lenient. Let's look at those plans for a second here. I hope you can see this. I've given this to all the TA students, and they're going to send this to you. It'll work. It helps. It's kind of a timeline plus a an expression of the substance of the two plans. Johnson's plan was states' rightist. He had a strong attachment to the Union, but nevertheless believed all power, when possible, belongs in the states. His slogan for Reconstruction sums it up. He said, the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was. Put the Union back together, but don't touch the Constitution. All right, 13th Amendment, that's already been done. Guess so. The war killed slavery. To Johnson, that was too bad, but got to accept it. But he will never support the 14th Amendment. He'll do everything he can to thwart it, and the same with the 15th. He also had a certain hatred, because he'd grown up a poor boy, even though he had owned about 11 slaves at one point. He'd grown up a poor boy in East Tennessee in the hill country. He wasn't even terribly literate until his wife helped him learn to fully read and write. He hated the planter class. He wanted to stick it to them. Those guys with those giant plantations, they're the ones who caused this war. They're the ones who dragged everything out of the Union, caused all this mess, this blood. He was never anti-slavery in the least, and he was a genuine white supremacist. He was also hypersensitive and obstinate. He was not a good politician in terms of deal-making. He was great on the stump. He could get up on the back of a hay wagon and give a hell of a stump speech in East Tennessee. He was good at that. But in D.C., dealing with people, not his favorite thing. He'd usually blow up at somebody, like he did to a delegation of black representatives led by Frederick Douglass in 1866. Douglass led a delegation of black leaders, including his own son and several other major black leaders, to the White House to go face-to-face with Andrew Johnson and beg him to support black suffrage and what the radical Republicans were doing. Johnson didn't listen to them. He gave them about a 45-minute speech telling them that their people will never live in equality in this country. And as they were leaving the room, Douglass finally kept interrupting Johnson. Mr. President, finally, Douglass got up and said, we're out of here. And they began to file out, and as they were filing out, they all overheard Johnson say, that Douglass, he's just like every other N-word you'll ever meet. He'll cut your throat as soon as he sees you. And I don't know exactly what Douglass thought at that moment, but I can imagine he must have looked around and probably looked back at Johnson and said to himself, not a bad idea. Now, peculiar guy though, because when he comes into power after Lincoln's death, he assuaged the radicals, at least for a month or two, by saying, treason must be made odious. We must hold the Confederates responsible. And, Charles Sumner went and met with him. Thought, well, maybe maybe we can deal with Johnson. Maybe we can find a way to deal with this guy, although maybe not. He announces it would only take less than 10% of the given voting population of a southern state to form a new constitution, accept the end of slavery, ratify the 13th Amendment, come back in the Union as fast as possible. Johnson said, that portion of the people who are loyal, any portion, wherever two or more gather, they want to create a new Georgia, they can do it. Fast as possible. He wanted all Southerners who owned $20,000 or more worth of property to be held out and disfranchised for a while. He wanted to punish the planter class, and he wanted to make them apply to him for clemency. And he will do that. Planters' wives, especially, planters themselves, but especially planters' wives who had survived this war, will start lining up at the White House to get pardons from Andrew Johnson, and he loved that. Walt Whitman got a job working in the corner of the White House, writing those pardons out. Poets need jobs. Now, those new Johnson governments, as they were called, were put in place in the fall of 1865. They started passing black codes, just like the old black codes, the slave codes. Black people couldn't be on public roads. Black people couldn't do this, couldn't do that, couldn't do this, couldn't do that, had no access to any kind of institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And he also did another thing. When Sherman took Savannah and his army moved north, very soon they set aside a region. Sherman wasn't so fond of doing this, but he found they had to. About 20 miles inland and 250 miles long down the coast, the great low country of Georgia, South Carolina, even into North Florida. They set aside that land for the allegedly perpetual inhabitation of freed slaves and their families. They would be given promissory notes they could pay back when they could. Now, there was a time on it, but it was to be land now redistributed from the old planters. This is some of the best land in North America, redistributed from the planters back to their former slaves. By September 1865, Andrew Johnson rescinded that order. It was called Sherman's Field Order Number 15. Thousands of black farmers put in a first planting on land they believed would be their own. Approximately 40,000 freed people participated in this. They got what the law said was 40 acres and a mule, or sort of. Hence that phrase. It used to be the title of Spike Lee's film company. October 65, not September. Johnson, here was the great dream of land redistribution, property redistribution. Call it whatever you want, but that's what it was. And it was cut off, given right back to its original owners if they could be found. If they could be found. Now, the radicals fight back. Do they ever? The congressional response, some of which is on the screen, designed by again, Lyman Trumbull, John Bingham, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, William Pitt Fessenden, another real moderate from Maine, who gets on board with this. The Republicans sustained a coalition here of their own party out of the sheer responsibility of what they felt. And this is key. Think about these people. That Republican Party, which came into existence in 1854 to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act and created this new coalition of, they got nativists, they got some former Democrats, they got a whole lot of former Whigs, and they got the new, they got the abolitionist circle with them. And man, it's a bunch of strange bedfellows, but there they have this amazing, potent coalition. They almost elected Fremont in 1856. They elect Lincoln in 1860. These men had grown up with this fight. They'd come of age with this fight. They were victors in this fight. They had something to preserve or create. They had many motives. Moral revulsion to Johnson's leniency, certainly one. They had political motives too. They wanted to plant the Republican Party in the South. How do you do that? Black votes. Big time. Don't deny them some political motives here. They're not all morally pure by any means. They had economic motives. They saw the South as America's new economic frontier. It was the new West. It was crushed. It was destroyed. It's there for the remaking. They had social motives. Many of them wanted to remake the South. And to some degree in the North's image. They wouldn't have minded if, a good congregational church was planted in some of those Alabama towns. Schools. This notion that all the radical Republicans ever wanted was to Yankeeize the South has always been overdone, but there's something to it. They established something, and it was on the outline, called the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. This was unprecedented. Unprecedented in American history. There'd never been a committee like this established to investigate something so vast and so big. It had 15 members. It starts meeting in January 1866. Johnson's government, so-called, these rapidly recreated little bubbles of governments, sent representatives to Washington in December to be sworn in, including Alexander H. Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy. A couple old colonels showed up in their Confederate uniforms to be sworn into Congress. And the Republicans, of course, had majorities, and they said, no. They simply shut the door. They said, there is no readmission. We will decide how and when. 15 members in the Joint Committee. It was stacked with the Republicans. There were only 3 Democrats. Surprise. They did all kinds of investigations. They held hearings with 144 witnesses. No congressional committee had ever done anything on this scale. Today we have congressional committees all the time, hearings and investigations. They wanted to know about many questions. What are the treatment of the freedmen in the South? And they would interview Freedmen's Bureau agents and Union officers and so on. They wanted to know about loyalty and disloyalty among the white Southerners. They heard a lot about that. Oh boy. They wanted to know if that Freedmen's Bureau, which had been set up in the winter of '65, was still necessary, and the answer was yes. The Freedmen's Bureau was this organization, never been anything like it in American history. It was the first major sort of social welfare agency of the federal government. It was set up to provide food, shelter, schooling, even the possibility of banking for the freed people in the South and for white refugees. Just as much for white refugees. There were hundreds of thousands of homeless white people in the South. They wanted to know about the need for troops. How long would they have to keep troops in the South? Where should they be? What sections of the South? Their conclusions? 1, it was madness to let the ex-Confederates run these new Southern governments. Madness, that's the word they used in the conclusions of the Joint Committee. 2, Johnson's level of leniency was, quote, foolish. And 3rd, they had to have legal safeguards of Reconstruction. And the first bill they will pass is the Civil Rights Act. It will pass in April of 1866. It's an extraordinary bill. It didn't go that far. If you actually read it in your reader, students, you will see that it looks pretty paltry compared to many, many other civil rights laws we've enacted since. But here is what it did. This is a federal civil rights act, the first of its kind in American history till then, passed over Andrew Johnson's veto, the first of many to come. In a 2-year period, Andrew Johnson will veto more laws than all previous presidents put together. It became government by passage of laws and veto by president. Government by veto. An override of veto. I believe it was 14 vetoes in 2 years, more than all previous presidents. The Civil Rights Act did not include political rights. It didn't touch voting. It created national citizenship for all persons except Indians. They use the term Indian, Native Americans. It's there, it's right there. Native Americans not included yet, and for quite some time. Lyman Trumbull, who wrote it, used the term fundamental rights to contract law and protection of one's free labor. And that law said that cases of discrimination were to be heard in, very important here, federal court, not state courts. But the bill also lacked precision. It lacked a certain clarity, a power of clarity. It was addressed only to public acts of discrimination, not private acts. An issue throughout our history, but here's where it begins. What's a public act? What's a private act of discrimination? When do you have the right to just say no to somebody because you don't like them? But it was the first effort to breathe some kind of meaning into that 13th Amendment. Well, you just ended slavery, but what do you do next? Okay. Then they passed that 14th Amendment. After ferocious debate, it will pass on June 8th, 1866. I think one of the most hallowed days in the history of the United States Congress. If we could ever agree on what the 14th Amendment actually means, it ought to have a giant it ought to have a memorial on the mall. But we'll never agree on what to put on it. 14th Amendment needs a memorial, a living memorial. It passed the Senate 38-11 and the House 138-36. It is the legal DNA under which you live. It actually was more than just Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It was a resounding answer to that ghost-like language in Roger B. Taney's Dred Scott decision saying black people have no rights that white people must acknowledge. 14th Amendment is saying, yes, they do. Now, okay, leave you with this. This is heading toward a terrible collision, of course, between Johnson and the radical Republicans, for that matter, the whole Republican Party. His behavior, for one thing, just kept driving them toward impeachment. His enactments, and please read it's actually in two parts of it's in the Gannap Reader, students, it's also in the Prince book, and everyone else who has those books. Read Andrew Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Bill. It's very short, but it sums up everything Andrew Johnson believed. Oh, does it ever? But here, you got to understand these radicals. Leave you with this. They had a certain ideology, and they were ascendant in this moment. From roughly the end of the war to 68, 69, when they get the 15th Amendment passed, more on that next week, or no, Thursday. They believe, first of all, in unionism. They're going to put this union back together somehow. They're determined about that. There's going to be a United States out of this. Secondly, they believed in equality to a degree. They're not all going to agree on the right to vote. That's a big one. But this notion of equality before law, they had more than a consensus on that. And that's a revolutionary turn in the history of modern jurisprudence in the whole world. And thirdly, very important, and it encompasses the first two, they believed in positive interventionist government. They believed in using government to reshape society. They had just used government in its most colossal way to win a war. They had just spent millions and millions of dollars to defeat the Confederacy. They passed the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad Act and the Morrill Act, creating land-grant colleges. Homestead Act was supposed to be the most democratic thing ever. It meant anybody, any slob could go west and just enclose a little land and it's going to belong to him if he builds a good fence around it. But these people believed government could do this now. They'd grown up doing this. They were all adherents of Daniel Raymond's theories of political economy. They believed in the labor theory of value. Labor itself was the greatest value in the world. And they wanted to maximize that. They're not going to fully succeed, to say the least. And everybody knows that, yeah, in the end, Reconstruction failed, and in the end, Reconstruction's a tragedy, and blah, blah, blah. But all around you today, you live with so many countless legacies of this moment. Every time we debate the role of government, every time we debate the extent of federalism, every time we debate states' rights, abortion should go to the states now. What is positive interventionist government anymore? One of our political parties believes in it, one of them doesn't. That's almost always the case, isn't it? How about that right to vote? Who has it? And how is it protected? Is it? Okay. I'll leave you here. Reconstruction came down to simple questions. One was, who's going to rule in the South? Ex-Confederates, the freed people, Yankees who moved there, or everybody? Second, who's going to rule in Washington, D.C.? Congress or the president? Talk about a testing here. Lincoln had the right word. Who's going to rule over Reconstruction? President, a presidency, or Congress? Third, what are the dimensions of black freedom? What did it actually mean that 4 million people were freed from slavery? And last but not least, is Reconstruction going to be a restoration of the old or a reinvention of the new? All four of those questions had to be answered all at the same time. And God, did black people vote when they got the chance. Come back to that. And Thomas Nast was waiting for this, the great cartoonist. Oh my God, did he give us a library full of, this is his sense of what happened by 1868, and we'll come back to that next time. It's a hideous image, but it represents a lot of what is going to happen faster than you might guess. Reconstruction is a rise and fall story. The rise is fast. The fall is prolonged, but just as precipitous. Thank you.